Imagine waking up, not to the smell of coffee or the comfort of your own bed, but to the stench of damp wood, unwashed bodies, and rotting food. There's no running water, just the oppressive darkness of a ship's hold and the sour, heavy air pressing in from all sides. Your breakfast? A rock-hard biscuit crawling with weevils. If you're lucky, you might avoid the rats. But the worst was yet to come. They called it scurvy. More on that in a moment. Magellan's expedition began with about 270 crew members, all crammed together and facing horrors you can barely imagine. Yet these men endured somehow to complete the first circumnavigation of the globe. As we step into dreamland, leave a comment below to let me know what your dream is in life. Now, as you settle in with clean sheets and a warm room, let's step into their world for a little while. Imagine climbing down a narrow ladder into the dark hull of Magellan's ship, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. It's thick, heavy, and inescapable. Your lungs reject it instinctively, but there's nowhere to escape. This rank mixture is the air you'll breathe for weeks, maybe months. It reeks of damp, swollen wood soaked in seawater, combined with the sharp tang of salty sweat that's been fermenting on unwashed bodies. The scent of rotting food lingers in the background too, faint but sickening when stirred up by the movements of the crew. And then there's the sour, almost gag-inducing hint of stagnant water pooled in the bilge below as it rots and festers. You might think your nose would eventually adjust, but down here, that stench sticks in your throat like a bad taste you can't swallow. That fetid atmosphere wasn't just unpleasant, it was suffocating. The lower decks of a 16th century caravel were poorly ventilated at best and nearly sealed off at worst. While fresh air might stream in above deck, below was a different story. Tight, cramped spaces squeezed dozens of sailors into close quarters, leaving just enough room to crouch or shuffle around. With no real cross-ventilation, the hold became a kind of human incubator. Everything foul hung in the air, thickened by the constant humidity of life at sea. Wood absorbed the moisture and slowly began to rot, releasing its own subtle but consistent stink. You couldn't escape it in your sleep either. Sailors would collapse onto bare, splintered planks, or coil themselves up in piles of rope. They didn't have hammocks back then, not yet invented for use on ships. Their only real blankets were the clothes on their backs, clothes that were, of course, as filthy as the waterless days would allow. Unwashed bodies were a major source of the misery. Fresh water was far too valuable to waste on cleaning yourself. Every precious drop was rationed, leaving the men to scrape by in whatever mess clung to their skin after days of hard labour. The sun baked their sweat into their clothes. The salt sprayed from the sea caked onto every surface. And before long, a sailor's shirt became nothing more than a thick, grimy crust. He couldn't peel off even if he wanted to. It wasn't uncommon to find every inch of skin covered in sores and infections. It's no surprise that lice and fleas thrived here, biting at skin that was already raw, scabby and irritated. Those same pests would crawl freely through whatever the sailors clutched to their chests at night for warmth, ensuring their misery had companions. Before you even think about rest, let me set the scene for you. The hold was never quiet. No chance for peaceful sleep when rats scrambled underfoot, gnawing away at wooden beams and tearing into the dwindling food supply. They weren't shy about racing over your legs either, especially if you were sprawled out to sleep on the filthy planks. Their droppings scattered everywhere, on your bed, in your provisions, even where the crew attempted to eat. But the rats weren't just nuisances, they were disease carriers. Along with flies, they played their own grim role as agents of pestilence, spreading illnesses that could take hold in such unsanitary conditions. Even the barely alert would glimpse some vermin darting right into the barrels of salted meat, fattening themselves on it faster than the crew did. Oh, and then there was the bilge water. That vile sludge sat at the lowest point of the ship, pooling with leaked seawater, filth, and anything else that worked its way downhill. Imagine wading into this reeking, soggy dungeon to clean it out. The unlucky sailor assigned to this duty would come back gasping for air, clothes drenched in a mix of salt water and something possibly worse. Many claim the fumes alone could make a man faint. A single breath of that putrid air would curl your stomach. And still, someone had to do it, because left alone, the bilge only rotted faster, and the already overwhelmed crew didn't need another reason for sickness to sweep through them. Diseases thrived in this environment, as you can imagine. A ship on the open ocean isn't exactly a sterile environment, and in these conditions every cut, scrape or sore became a potential death sentence. Bacteria feasted on the filth. Skin infections weren't just common, they were expected. A simple blister from tugging on rigging could fester until the flesh itself turned black and rotted. Without any way to treat it, these infections spread into the body quickly, leading to fevers, delirium, and eventually death. And those lucky enough to survive the infection usually found that gangrene took care of the rest. A sailor might as well have carved a notch for himself in the ship's wooden beams. It could soon become his grave marker. The air itself carried its own poison. Cramped quarters ensured that everything exhaled stayed trapped, lingering. Sailors coughed wetly into the air, letting sickness spread from bunk to bunk. Dysentery became a regular reality, sapping the already starved men of whatever strength they had left. The sight of someone doubled over in pain or crawling to the edge of the deck to rid themselves of bile was so common that nobody batted an eye. This kind of suffering became accepted, something to endure rather than fight against. Even the officers weren't spared entirely from the misery, because the alternative to the suffocating hold wasn't necessarily better. Their shared quarters offered brief privacy, but with the same lack of ventilation, their small cabins often reeked just as strongly. Sometimes, in an attempt to escape, the captain and his officers would opt to sleep on the open deck, braving the cold night air just to avoid that bottomless pit of foulness below. Still, the majority of the crew didn't have the luxury of escaping the bowels of the ship. They were stuck in those suffocating quarters, marinating in their surroundings until they started smelling like them too. What's truly haunting about these conditions is that the misery didn't just stop at strong smells or physical discomfort. Living in this atmosphere, with no relief day after day, weighed on the body in ways that men could only begin to understand. You'd watch your crewmates waste away before your eyes, strong men reduced to gaunt shadows. Food might keep you alive for a little while longer, but as filth and bacteria filled your lungs and your gut, your strength melted away. Joints ached from constant labour, skin reddened and cracked from salt exposure mixed with grime, and an intangible lethargy stuck to the bones like rust on the ship's hull. Feel that ache in your chest yet? The reality of breathing that toxic air wasn't just asphyxiating, it was killing you in slow motion. You wouldn't know it, of course. No one really understood disease on that level. But they could see the effects. The coughing, the wheezing, the infections, and the rot. It came from somewhere. But to the sailors, it just seemed like fate was inevitably cruel. You couldn't blame them for turning to religion, superstition, or even fits of desperation as the months dragged on. And that's the thing. There was no escape from it. This wasn't some temporary discomfort. This was life. Once you were aboard the ship, you weren't just sailing into the horizon. You were stepping into a confined world that wouldn't let you forget its presence for a single second. During a time when survival on land already came with its own challenges, life at sea was an entirely new level of brutality. But the unrelenting misery didn't just stay within the boundaries of discomfort. It had deadly consequences. Disease was borne down in that dark, stinking hold and spread like wildfire. When the rations didn't kill you, when the weather didn't capsize you, the stink and all that came with it might just finish the job. This wasn't about managing to tolerate an unpleasant smell or swatting away the pest that lived among you. It was life or death in the most relentless way possible. Of course, these weren't just tragedies waiting to happen. The smell itself hinted at the death toll ahead. It told you this wasn't just a voyage of discovery. It was survival against the odds. Stale air, the ever-present rot of life below deck, and the echoes of misery weren't just sensory details. They were warnings about how fragile, exposed, and ultimately mortal you all were. Disease lived here, waiting, patient, soaking into the wood grain. Eventually it claimed almost every sailor. That was the cost of living stuffed into close quarters in the belly of Magellan's ship. Now that you've taken in the stench, let's look at how food, or the lack of it, only made survival even harder. You reach for your meal, if you can call it that. It's a biscuit, but not the kind you'd want with a cup of tea. This is hardtack, the foundation of every sailor's diet on Magellan's ships. It's a pale, thick slab, square and flat, about as appetizing as a chunk of drywall. The first bite is a test of willpower and jaw strength. You gnaw at the edge, teeth straining, and wonder if you're eating food or trying to break a rock. That's when you notice the movement. A tiny black weevil, squirming out of a hole left by your last bite, completely unfazed by your presence. You flick it away, or maybe you don't. By now, you've learned to ignore them. The crew jokes about the extra protein, but no one's really laughing. Hardtack, sometimes called ship's biscuit, was made from flour and water, baked until it was hard enough to survive months at sea. Sometimes, if supplies allowed, a bit of lard was mixed in, though that was rare and not always an option on Magellan's voyage. The goal was simple: make something that wouldn't spoil. The reality, though, was that these biscuits became breeding grounds for weevils and other insects. Eggs hidden in the flour would hatch as the weeks dragged on, and by the time you opened a barrel, your rations were already moving. The only thing worse than the taste was the texture: dry, gritty, and crawling. You might think salted meat would break the monotony. Think again. Chunks of beef or pork packed in barrels of coarse salt were supposed to last the journey. The salt did its job, but maybe too well. After months at sea, the meat was so salty you could barely choke it down, even after soaking it in seawater to wash out the brine. Sometimes the meat had the consistency of shoe leather. Sometimes it was slimy or streaked with mould. The smell when a barrel was cracked open could clear a room, if you had anywhere else to go. If you were lucky, you'd get a piece that was only tough, not rancid. If you were unlucky, well, you'd eat it anyway. Hunger didn't leave room for being picky. Fresh food was a distant memory. Early in the voyage, the fleet carried some cheese, almonds, figs, even a few rounds of preserved quince for the officers. There were 7 cows and 3 pigs loaded on board, a gesture toward variety and maybe even morale. But that didn't last. The livestock was slaughtered early, the cheese went mouldy or was hoarded, and the fruit was long gone before you even crossed the equator. What you were left with was the same: hardtack and salted meat, day after day, meal after meal. And then there were the rats. They thrived on ships, feasting on the same grain and meat the crew depended on. At first, you tried to keep them away from your food, but as supplies dwindled, rats became more than just pests. If you caught one, it was fresh meat, a rare luxury. Sailors quickly learned to see rats as competition, not just vermin. The taste? Not terrible, at least compared to everything else. In the end, a cooked rat was a prize, and no one cared about the details. When even the rats ran out or got too smart to catch, desperation set in. Men boiled their leather belts, shoes, even scraps of rope, hoping for anything that resembled nourishment. The resulting broth was little more than salty water with a faint, musty taste of old hide. It didn't matter. Hunger made you do things you never imagined. You'd gag, maybe, but you'd still drink it. The goal was simple. Keep something in your stomach, no matter what it was. The lack of variety wasn't just boring, it was dangerous. With no fresh fruit or vegetables, your body started to rebel. The meals you forced down every day gave you calories, but not much else. Scurvy was waiting in the wings, a constant threat that everyone could feel but no one could see, at least not at first. Malnutrition crept in slowly. You'd notice it when a small cut refused to heal, or when a bruise from hauling rope turned dark and spread. Your gums felt tender, teeth ached, and your energy faded. Each day the work of sailing became harder. You'd see men collapse from exhaustion, unable to climb the rigging or even stand for roll call. The ship was filled with the sounds of coughing, groaning, and the shuffle of feet dragging across the deck. There's no getting around it. The food on Magellan ships wasn't just unappetizing, it was a slow-motion disaster. The biscuits and salted meat kept you alive, but only just. Every meal was a gamble. Would you get a biscuit with fewer weevils, a piece of meat without the greenish tinge, or maybe, if you were lucky, a spoonful of something that didn't make you gag? Most days you just ate what you were given and tried not to think about it too much. The officers sometimes fared a little better. They had their own stores, maybe a bit of quince paste, a wedge of cheese, or a jar of pickled vegetables. But even those luxuries ran out. Disease and hunger didn't care about rank. When supplies ran low, everyone suffered. The only difference was how long you could hold out before desperation took over. It's easy to joke about weevils and rats when you're not hungry, but out here, every bite matters. You learn to eat fast before the insects crawl out. You ignore the smell, the taste, the texture. You focus on survival. That's what these meals became. Not a pleasure, not even a comfort, but a daily test of endurance. There's a kind of grim camaraderie in it. You and your shipmates swap stories about the worst thing you've eaten, the biggest rat you've caught, the time someone found a maggot in their biscuit and just shrugged. You laugh, because the alternative is thinking too hard about what you're actually putting in your mouth. You keep going, because there's no other choice. But the truth is, this diet did more than test your willpower. It wore you down, day by day. The lack of fresh food meant your body was running on empty, scraping by on calories but starving for nutrients. The longer the voyage went on, the more obvious the toll became. Cuts festered, teeth loosened, muscles cramped. You watched your friends grow thin and pale, their eyes hollow, their hands shaking. The food kept you alive, but only just. With no fresh fruit, scurvy was waiting in the wings. More on that next. So, as you force down another mouthful of weevil-infested hardtack, you start to notice changes you can't ignore. Your gums ache, your skin bruises at the slightest touch, and you feel weaker every day. The real nightmare isn't just what you're eating, it's what your body's about to go through. It starts in your mouth. Your gums swell, turning soft and spongy, until your teeth feel like they're floating in bruised, tender flesh. The pain is sharp, stabbing every time you try to eat, and brushing is out of the question. Soon, your gums bleed at the slightest touch. The blood tastes metallic, sour, and your breath turns foul, a constant reminder that something inside you is breaking down. Over the next days, your teeth loosen. Some fall out, others hang on by threads, making every bite a gamble. It doesn't stop there. Purple blotches bloom on your skin, old wounds open up again, and new sores appear, raw, weeping, impossible to heal. Even a small scratch from a rope or splinter can become a festering ulcer that refuses to close. This is scurvy, and it's relentless. On Magellan's ships, scurvy was the silent executioner. No one knew why it struck, only that after weeks without fresh food, men began to wither. The cause, vitamin C deficiency, was a mystery, but the pattern was clear. As soon as the last orange or onion was gone, the clock started ticking. At first you might feel tired, maybe a little stiff. You ignore it. Then your legs swell, every joint aches, and you watch as your body begins to betray you. Sailors called it the plague of long voyages, and for good reason. The disease didn't just make you sick, it stripped away your strength, your dignity, and for many, your life. The symptoms only got worse. Gums bled constantly. Sores opened on your legs and arms, some as big as your palm, leaking pus and blood. Your skin turned pale and bruised at the slightest touch. You'd catch a whiff of yourself and realize the smell wasn't just from the ship. It was coming from you. A foul odour, described in old nautical medicine books, clung to your body, marking you as one of the doomed. Sometimes you'd see a shipmate's leg swell until the skin split, revealing ulcers that wouldn't heal. Walking became a luxury. Climbing the rigging or hauling lines, forget it. You'd collapse, panting, joints locked up, too weak to move. Nobody understood the cure. Some officers, by luck or rank, got preserved quince or other rare treats, one of the few sources of vitamin C left on board. These men sometimes escaped the worst, watching as the rest of the crew wasted away. For everyone else, the only hope was to reach land and find fresh food, but that was months away. Until then, you watched your friends rot beside you, powerless to help. Scurvy was just the beginning. The ship itself was a floating disease factory. Every surface was coated in grime, every barrel of water a potential disaster. Dysentery or bloody flux swept through the crew. It started with stomach cramps, then relentless diarrhea, sometimes mixed with blood, leaving you dehydrated and weak. There was no privacy, no clean place to rest. You'd see men doubled over, clutching their bellies, trying to work while their bodies failed them. Lips cracked, skin peeled, and the constant loss of fluids made even simple tasks impossible. Dehydration finished off men who'd survived everything else. Cuts and scrapes, which should have been minor annoyances, turned deadly fast. The ropes were rough, the planks splintered, and the tools dull. A small wound was an open invitation for infection. With no clean bandages or disinfectant, bacteria thrived. Your hands swelled, turned red, then black. The smell was unmistakable. Gangrene. If you were lucky, the barber surgeon would amputate before the infection spread. If you weren't, the rot crept up your arm or leg, and you faded away in agony. The surgery itself was almost as dangerous as the infection. The barber surgeon's saw was rarely cleaned, and the only anaesthesia was a swig of liquor. You were held down while he cut, hoping the shock wouldn't kill you. More often than not, infection returned, and the cycle started over. The air below deck didn't help. It was thick with the fumes of tar, candle smoke, sweat and waste. Breathing became a chore. Coughs echoed in the darkness, wet, hacking, endless. Respiratory illness worked its way through the crew, leaving men feverish and weak. With no fresh air, lungs filled with dampness and smoke, and every breath hurt. You'd see men shivering with chills one day, and burning with fever the next. There was no medicine, no rest, just the hope that your body could fight it off. Rats and insects made everything worse. Rats chewed through barrels of food and water, leaving droppings behind. They brought fleas, which bit and infected the crew. You'd wake up scratching, only to find red, swollen bites that sometimes turned into boils. The rats themselves carried disease, spreading it with every scurry and bite. They were nearly impossible to get rid of, immune to the filth that made humans sick. The insects, lice, fleas, and more infested every inch of clothing, bedding, and hair. The constant itching drove men mad, and the wounds from scratching often became infected. The barber surgeon was supposed to help, but there was little he could do. His main tools were a razor, a saw, and a few dirty bandages. He might stitch a wound or pull a tooth, but against scurvy or dysentery he was powerless. Bloodletting was a common cure, draining bad humours, they thought, but it only made the weak weaker. If you came in with a fever, he'd offer warm compresses and maybe a prayer. Amputations were done on the open deck with the whole crew watching. There were no antibiotics, no real pain relief, and no hope of true recovery. Most sailors left his care worse off than when they arrived. Disease didn't care about rank. Officers might have better food or private quarters, but the air, the rats, and the water were the same for everyone. The difference was only how long you could hold out. Some officers escaped scurvy thanks to their preserved quints, but even they weren't immune to the endless parade of infections, coughs and fevers. The rest of the crew watched as friends wasted away, their bodies shrinking, their skin yellowing, their eyes hollow. Every day you woke up wondering who would be next. The ship was shrinking, not just from the miles behind you, but from the steady loss of men. The dead were wrapped in cloth and dropped overboard, sometimes 3 or 4 a day. There were no funerals, just a quick prayer and the splash of a body hitting the sea. The deck was quieter, the work harder, and the sense of dread heavier with each passing week. No one escaped the psychological toll. You might survive the sores, the bleeding gums, the endless diarrhea, but watching your friends die, sometimes right beside you, left scars that never healed. The smell of sickness, the groans of pain, the sight of wounds that wouldn't close. It all became normal. You learned to ignore it, to keep moving, to hope your own body held out just a little longer. But on Magellan's ships, survival wasn't just about escaping disease. The rules were strict, and the punishments for breaking them were brutal. If you were caught stealing food, or even thinking about it, you faced a new kind of agony. The daily struggle against hunger and illness was matched only by the fear of what would happen if you stepped out of line. You don't remember reaching for the bread. Hunger turns decisions into reflexes, and by the time you realize what you've done, it's too late. Now your arms are yanked behind your back, rope biting into your wrists, and you're hoisted up until your shoulders scream. The pain is sharp, immediate, and impossible to ignore. This isn't just punishment, it's a spectacle. The strappado, or something close to it, borrowed from the grim playbook of the Inquisition, is meant to make an example of you. You dangle in front of the crew, your body a warning, step out of line, and you'll pay for it. The bread you stole wasn't worth it, but that's not the point. The message is clear, and it's burned into everyone who watches. Discipline on Magellan's ships wasn't a suggestion. It was the backbone of survival, enforced by the laws of Oleron and the absolute authority of the captain. Every rule, from keeping watch to rationing food, was designed to keep the ship running and the crew alive. In a world where every mistake could mean disaster, even a minor slip, like swiping an extra ration, was treated as a threat to everyone. Stealing food was seen as sabotage. The punishment? Flogging, usually with a knotted rope whip up to 99 lashes. Each hit left its mark, both on your back and in the minds of the crew. The pain was personal, but the lesson was public. But flogging wasn't the end of it. Some punishments went further, drawing directly from the era's harshest traditions. Take the toka, for example. A cloth is shoved into your mouth, water poured over it until you choke and panic. It's the sensation of drowning, over and over, used to break your will and force confessions. These were not just punishments. They were warnings, designed to keep everyone in line. The fear they created was as important as the physical pain. The crew learned to watch, to listen, and to obey. because the alternative was always worse. If you thought stealing was bad, mutiny was the cardinal sin. The ship at St. Julian is a lesson in what happens when authority is challenged. 2 captains who led the mutiny didn't just lose their positions, they lost their lives in the most gruesome way possible. Hung, drawn, and quartered, their bodies left on display for months, their fate a constant reminder of who was in charge. Juan de Cartagena, another mutineer, was left to starve on a barren island, exiled with only a priest for company. Magellan could be ruthless, but sometimes he chose exile over execution, less for mercy, more for effect. Other punishments blurred the line between discipline and torture. Running the gauntlet was a group affair, the accused forced to stumble down a line of crewmates, each armed with a rope, stick, or whatever was at hand. Every blow landed with a mix of anger and relief. Better to be the one swinging than the one running. The pain was immediate, but the humiliation lingered. Everyone was forced to play a part, and that kept the boundaries clear. Then there was keel hauling, a punishment so feared it barely needed to be used. The threat alone was enough. A sailor tied to a rope dragged under the ship's hull, barnacles tearing skin, lungs filling with seawater. Most didn't survive. Those who did carried scars for life. Even if the punishment wasn't common on Magellan ships, the possibility hung over the crew like a shadow. It was a reminder that the ocean wasn't the only thing that could kill you out here. The list of crimes and their consequences was long. Gambling, fighting, failing to follow orders, each had its own penalty. Some were whipped, some were put in irons, some left without food or water for days. The worst crimes, murder or mutiny, meant death, and the method was always chosen for maximum impact. Sometimes, a murderer would be lashed to the corpse of his victim and thrown overboard, a final grisly lesson for the rest of the crew. The message was simple. Survival depended on trust and order, and anyone who threatened that would pay the price. Magellan himself was the centre of this system. He enforced the rules with a mix of severity and discretion. He wasn't always quick to execute. Sometimes he'd remove a man from command or maroon him instead. But when he needed to make a point, he didn't hesitate. The mutiny at St. Julian proved that. Afterward, the crew worked with a new sense of caution. Fear was as much a tool as the whip or the rope. It kept the men working, kept them in line, and, at least for a while, kept them alive. The psychological effect of these punishments was just as powerful as the physical pain. Every sailor knew the rules. Every sailor watched what happened when those rules were broken. The threat of violence hung in the air, unspoken but always present. It was a system built on fear, and it worked. The crew obeyed, not out of loyalty but out of self-preservation. Dissent faded, replaced by a kind of grim cooperation. No one wanted to be the next example. This atmosphere of terror wasn't just about keeping the peace, it was about survival. On a ship where every man's work mattered, one act of rebellion or carelessness could doom everyone. The punishments were brutal, but they kept the expedition moving forward. Even the harshest measures made sense in a world where order was the only thing standing between life and death. The crew might have hated the rules, but they understood why they existed. Still, the scars, both physical and mental, never really faded. You'd see them in the way men flinched at a raised voice, or how they glanced over their shoulders before speaking. The discipline was effective, but it left its mark. Loyalty born of fear is thin and brittle. Mutinies could be crushed, but resentment simmered below the surface. For every man punished, there were 10 more who wondered if they'd be next. And yet, the work never stopped. Punishment was just one part of the daily grind. The real challenge was keeping the ship afloat hour after hour, day after day. Even after the lash marks faded, the chores remained. The sun would rise and the endless routine would begin again. This atmosphere of terror wasn't just about keeping the peace, it was about survival. On a ship where every man's work mattered, one act of rebellion or carelessness could doom everyone. The punishments were brutal, but they kept the expedition moving forward. Even the harshest measures made sense in a world where order was the only thing standing between life and death. The crew might have hated the rules, but they understood why they existed. Still, the scars, both physical and mental, never really faded. You'd see them in the way men flinched at a raised voice, or how they glanced over their shoulders before speaking. The discipline was effective, but it left its mark. Loyalty born of fear is thin and brittle. Mutinies could be crushed, but resentment simmered below the surface. For every man punished, there were 10 more who wondered if they'd be next. And yet, the work never stopped. Punishment was just one part of the daily grind. The real challenge was keeping the ship afloat hour after hour, day after day. Even after the lash marks faded, the chores remained. The sun would rise and the endless routine would begin again. Below the waterline, another challenge loomed. The hull of the ship wasn't immune to the wear and tear of the ocean. Barnacles clung to the wood like unwelcome guests, thickening over time and slowing the ship's progress through the water. Cleaning them wasn't as simple as scrubbing them off from the deck. The method of careening, or heaving down, required intentional manoeuvring. The ship had to be sailed into shallow waters during high tide. As the tide receded, the crew used ropes to tilt the massive vessel onto its side, exposing the hull for maintenance. Then teams of sailors, exhausted already from hauling the ship into position, descended to scrape off the barnacles, weeds, and other debris clinging to the wood. It wasn't just tedious, it was back-breaking. And let's not forget the added bonus of sharp barnacle fragments slicing open unsuspecting hands. But barnacles weren't the only problem below deck. Cracks in the hull needed to be sealed with oakum, a material made from old tar-coated ropes painstakingly unravelled by hand. These tarred fibres were tightly packed into the gaps between planks, a process that didn't just smell awful but required precision. A poorly sealed gap could let in water and spell disaster for everyone. Speaking of water, let's talk about the bilge. This was, without question, the most dreaded duty on board. No one wanted to be the poor soul assigned to operate the bilge pump. The bilge was the lowest point of the ship, where seawater, waste and general filth collected over time. The result? A putrid, slimy pool of liquid that grew thicker and smellier by the day. The pumps themselves weren't exactly marvels of engineering. They were rudimentary, often made from hollowed-out logs with plungers shoved down them to force the water out. It was exhausting, and the stench down in the bilge was enough to make even the saltiest sailor gag. Imagine standing in that foul muck, your arms shaking from pumping endlessly, with no relief in sight. Yet, letting the bilge water pile up wasn't an option. Without constant removal, the ship's stability was at risk, and the extra weight could cause the vessel to sit lower in the water, making it harder to move and more vulnerable to waves. And when a storm hit, forget about routine tasks. Chaos erupted, and every sailor was called to action. Sails had to be reefed, essentially pulled in and secured, to prevent the wind from ripping them apart. The rigging became a death trap, with sailors scrambling up and down, fighting the slippery ropes and the cold, howling wind. The deck turned into a swirling mess of seawater and desperation as waves crashed over the sides. The carpenter had his own work cut out for him as well, rushing to reinforce masts that creaked and groaned under the strain. Sometimes waves would punch holes straight into the hull, and sailors would be suspended over the edge of the ship, hammering wooden patches into place, water spraying in their faces. The work didn't stop until the storm passed, or until exhaustion claimed someone mid-task. Other roles needed just as much focus. The gunner, for example, was in charge of keeping the ship's cannons clean and free of rust. Those cannons were vital in case of hostile encounters, and any misfire could be fatal. The cooper, meanwhile, had the utterly thankless but essential job of maintaining the barrels that stored food, water and gunpowder. If a barrel leaked, it wasn't just wasteful. It endangered the entire operation. Every job, from the mundane to the critical, contributed to the intricate machine that kept the expedition alive. No one could slack off, not if they wanted to see land again. After all that, you'd think rest would come as a reward. But the funny thing is, sailors were never completely off duty. Even during unofficial off hours, the call could come to repair something that had broken in the middle of the night, or assist with an emergency task. Sleep came in fits and starts, stolen between waves of demands. The lines between exhaustion, survival, and bare existence blurred more and more each day. But here's the remarkable part. Despite it all, the crew kept going. The endless grind wore them down, yet they rose each day to meet it again. It wasn't about pride or determination. It was about understanding that every task, no matter how small or grueling, mattered. They weren't just working to make life easier, they were working to stay alive. The ship demanded attention, tireless care, and an unbreaking cycle of labour. Failure to meet those demands meant disaster, not just for one sailor, but for all of them. For all the exhaustion and monotony, some found solace in the camaraderie born from shared suffering. Even in the midst of back-breaking labour, there were moments of connection. A passing joke while scraping barnacles, a faint grin during a rare break. But mostly it was survival. The grueling effort to keep the ship afloat was a testament to resilience, an ability to endure through sheer necessity. They weren't just exploring the edges of the map, they were proving how far a person could push themselves before breaking. Of course, once the day's work slowed, a new challenge cropped up: the isolation. The days blurred into nights, and the endless ocean stretched around them, offering nothing but emptiness. The next battle wasn't about physical endurance, it was about keeping their minds in one piece. How did sailors cope with such monotonous, isolated lives? That's what we'll unpack next. You're standing on deck, surrounded by the rhythmic chaos of shipwork, and you hear them before you understand them. Words and phrases that feel more like code than language. Quick, sharp bursts of speech that you're somehow expected to grasp immediately. Belay that line. Ease the main brace. Mind the futtock shrouds. It's disorienting at first. They may as well be speaking another language entirely. But in this world, far from the shores of anything familiar, this language isn't just a tool, it's survival. Sailor speak was like the DNA of life at sea, a unique dialect bred from necessity. Every term, every order had meaning, honed for the single goal of making sure the right task was done at the right time. On a ship like Magellan's, hours could be the difference between life and death. A malformed order could send a cannon tipping loose across the deck, or a critical sail flapping uselessly in the wind. There was no room for interpretation here. The words were direct, sharp, and deliberately efficient. Without them, chaos would take hold faster than the ocean could claim your ship. Let's start with the ropes, though, spoiler alert, you'd never call them ropes. Out here, every line had a name and a purpose. There were halyards, used to hoist the sails, sheets, attached to the corners of sails to control their angle. There were braces, stays, and shrouds. Each one had a role to play in keeping the mast upright and the ship moving forward. Lash that coil wasn't just a casual suggestion. It was an exact command, meaning you had to secure a bundle of rope in just the right way, or risk the lines unravelling during the next squall. Then there was the art of knotting, a simple word that masked what was essentially a craft as complex as carpentry. Each knot had its name and function: the bowline to secure a line, the clove hitch for fastening it temporarily, and the rolling hitch for gripping slippery surfaces. You didn't just tie things, you lashed, you seized, you wormed, and you parcelled. If you didn't know how to do those things, you weren't much use to the crew, but sailor speak didn't stop at technicalities. It bled into every corner of life on board. Futok, for instance, referred to the curved timber of the ship's frame, but it also gave its name to the futok shrouds, those treacherous networks of rope sailors climbed to reach the top of the masts. Trips up there weren't optional, by the way. If the bosun, the ship's hard-nosed taskmaster of all things rigging, barked at you to go aloft and check the shrouds, you climbed. No argument, and no hesitation. That language wasn't just for clarity, it demanded immediate obedience. What's fascinating is how this vocabulary also became an identity. To the untrained ear, sailor speak was unintelligible. To outsiders, it was a wall that separated landlubbers from true seafarers. It wasn't just a way of communicating, it was a badge of exclusivity, a kind of shared badge that marked someone as belonging to the Brotherhood of the Sea. Understanding this dialect meant you were part of the fold, part of the crew. It was something those on land couldn't penetrate, and in a way that was part of its appeal. Out here, sentences like "bend the larboard, clew garnet" weren't just slang. They were declarations of belonging in a world so isolated from everything familiar. Still, there was no glamour in it. This was a dialect born from hardship, shaped by the need to survive. Every quick instruction or shouted command was like a lifeline stretched across the often violent waters. Picture this. Your ship tilts dangerously during a storm. The wind howls so loud you can barely hear your own thoughts, and you feel the spray of seawater sting your eyes. Someone shouts, "Hard to starboard and clew up the forecourse." You don't stop to think. You don't ask questions. You run to your post, hands tightening around slippery lines, because that language is more than sound at this point. It's instinct. It's the only thing standing between you and disaster. Some phrases reflected the grim humour sailors developed to cope with their lives. For example, the lowest deck on the ship was often called the orlop, but sailors nicknamed it the land of the living dead. It was where wounded or sick crew members were often sent, tended to, or left to rot by the ship's ill-equipped barber surgeon. Harsh, sure, but gallows humour was one of the few ways they made sense of the horror. Another well-known phrase, "to the bitter end," actually referred to the last bit of rope tied to the mast or capstan. Once you reached the bitter end, there was no more line to give. Applies metaphorically to life at sea, doesn't it? And then there were the little moments of camaraderie hidden in the language. While much of sailor speak was harsh and commanding, sometimes it allowed room for levity, a rare and precious thing out here. Phrases like "son of a gun" came directly from ship life, likely referring to sailors born aboard when women, occasional passengers on merchant or military ships, gave birth near the ship's guns. Hardly the light-hearted origin we might imagine today, but it reflected their reality with a kind of resigned humour. Meanwhile, terms like "all hands to quarters" pulled everyone together. It wasn't optional. When you heard this command, you knew it was time to leave your grudges, weariness, or personal fears behind. The ship needed you, and so did your crew. What's even more remarkable is how ingrained this language became. Over time, you didn't need to think about it anymore. A term like "splice the main brace," once gibberish to a new recruit, would flow off your tongue as naturally as breathing. By then, you'd know it meant to drink a ration of alcohol, a rare reward after grueling, dangerous work. Or you'd understand immediately what it meant to pipe down, the signal from the bosun's whistle marking the end of the working day. Not that sailors ever really stopped working. It just meant you'd get a few precious moments to collapse before another shift started. For all the camaraderie this secret world of language built, It also pressed the crew further into isolation. On land, their slang and shorthand only made them more alien to those they returned to. You can picture it, can't you? A worn sailor finally steps foot on solid ground after months at sea. He's surrounded by the sights and smells of life on land, but his words betray where he's been. He talks of larboards and luffing, and land-bound men and women stare blankly back. Even the way he speaks marks him as someone belonging not to this place, but to the ceaseless, hostile waters just beyond the horizon. The language passed between crew members, once a weapon for survival, now serves as a barrier, one even thicker than the ship's hull. But back on board, it was different. Among the tangle of ropes and the groan of timbers underfoot, sailor speak was a lifeline. Even if it sounded coarse or strange, each word reminded the crew of their shared reality. Alone in the vastness of the sea, cut off from the world they left behind, language kept them anchored, to their tasks, to their ship, and to each other. It solidified a bond as necessary for survival as food or water, even when their supplies of those ran out. And in the world of Magellan's voyage, where every day was another battle against starvation, storms and sickness, language was one of the few things they could control. They didn't choose the endless ocean or the grim conditions, but they chose, or maybe created, their own way of enduring it. Out there, words weren't just tools, they were a form of existence. Every heave-ho and mind your step was a little act of defiance against the enormous, indifferent sea. It might not seem like much, but on Magellan's ships that defiance was everything. Of course, language is only one part of the story. A crew this tight-knit and this isolated didn't stop at words. Their relationships with each other were just as crucial to survival, but on a ship like this, tight quarters and months away from home didn't always bring out the best in people. Next, we'll look at life aboard from a much more personal angle, the fragile, sometimes fiery dynamic among the men who made this voyage possible. Imagine yourself trapped on a floating wooden prison, surrounded by men who are either your closest allies, your bitter rivals, or something uncomfortably in between. Every glance, every word, every shared chore carried a weight that couldn't be avoided. On Magellan's ship, there wasn't enough room to step away from anyone, not physically, not emotionally. The cramped quarters turned every relationship, every interaction, into a delicate balancing act. And out here, in the middle of the ocean, tensions didn't just simmer, they boiled over. The crew was a strange collection of people to begin with. They came from across Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, Germany, and Greece. They came with different traditions, different languages, and different allegiances. Imagine trying to bond with someone when you don't even fully understand what they're muttering under their breath. On top of that, Magellan, a Portuguese captain working for Spain, already had one strike against him in the eyes of his Spanish officers. For some, following his orders felt more like a bitter obligation than a shared mission. The Spanish authorities didn't trust him, and neither did his men. It's hard to inspire camaraderie when there's already a cloud of suspicion hanging over your command. Now take that lack of trust and throw in months of starvation, exhaustion, and illness. When you're stuck together for that long, frustration builds at record speed. Sailors fought over the smallest slights, who got the bigger chunk of maggot-riddled hardtack, who wasn't pulling their weight during a storm, who stole someone's tiny stash of wine. In such an unforgiving environment, every perceived injustice felt personal. Fights weren't just common, they were inevitable. And these weren't polite disagreements, they were brutal, often resolved with fists or blunted tools. The officers would intervene, of course, but even punishment didn't erase the bitterness. The memories of those arguments lingered, festering, adding to the constant tension. But it wasn't all conflict. Strange as it sounds, the hardships also gave birth to a kind of camaraderie among the crew. When everyone's miserable, it feels natural to bond over it. Picture a few sailors laughing at how bad the meat smelled today, or sharing a quiet joke about the rats that stole their bread. It's dark humour, sure, but it's also a way to survive. They worked side by side, hauling ropes and bracing sails, living through the same storms and the same punishments. And sometimes that shared misery stitched the crew together in ways they didn't even realise. Take the young apprentices or grumettes. These boys, barely more than children, had some of the dirtiest, hardest jobs on the ship. They climbed the rigging in raging storms, ran errands for officers, and endured endless hazing from the older sailors. Yet, in their struggle to prove themselves worthy of becoming full-fledged marineros, they often earned the respect of the men around them. It wasn't uncommon for older, more experienced sailors to take these boys under their wing, teaching them the ropes, literally, and defending them against harsher treatment. In a place where survival was rarely guaranteed, these moments of mentorship weren't just about passing down skill sets. They were small, fragile acts of kindness in an otherwise brutal environment. But for every story of camaraderie, there was another of sabotage and rebellion. The mutinies on Magellan's voyage were legendary, in no small part thanks to the sheer desperation that fueled them. The first major rebellion surfaced when Juan de Cartagena, one of the Spanish captains, accused Magellan of endangering the entire fleet. It wasn't just about the dangers of the sea, it was personal distrust of Magellan's leadership. Cartagena was removed from his post and confined, but the bitterness didn't evaporate. It simmered, feeding into even greater unrest later on. At Port St. Julian, that tension erupted into full rebellion. Cartagena wasn't done fighting, and he found willing co-conspirators in Gaspar de Quesada and Luis Mendoza, who were equally displeased with Magellan's control. Together, they orchestrated a calculated takeover, seizing 3 of the fleet's 5 ships. For a brief moment the rebellion seemed unstoppable, but Magellan's response was swift and brutal. He regained control, executed Quesada and Mendoza, and marooned Cartagena on an island with a priest. Imagine the silence that followed. The remaining crew must have realised with a sinking dread what Magellan was capable of if he sensed betrayal. Despite all this, there were glimmers of humanity even in the worst moments. One such instance was during a brutal storm, where a sailor nearly fell overboard while trying to secure a loose line. A fellow crewman caught him at the last second, risking his own life to save someone he barely spoke to outside of work. It wasn't discussed afterward. There wasn't time or energy for heartfelt conversations, but that silent sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. Survival had a way of uniting even the most divided crew. Of course, alliances were fragile. When resources ran low, competition flared up once again. The rationing of water, for instance, created enormous tension. Officers, as expected, received larger shares than the common sailors, leaving the lower ranks bitter and parched. And when the crew started resorting to eating rats and boiling leather, you can bet those rations weren't evenly split either. Yet, the unspoken rule remained. Fairness didn't matter as long as the ship kept moving. Everyone knew that personal grievances came second to the mission, even if it left an ache behind. Pigafetta, the chronicler of the voyage, recorded a fascinating duality among the crew. On one hand, he recounted moments of loyalty and brotherhood. He wrote of sailors sharing what little they had, offering scraps of extra food or a comforting word when someone was too weak to work. These small gestures didn't solve their problems, but they reminded everyone on board that they weren't suffering alone. On the other hand, Pigafetta also spared no detail when it came to the conflicts. He described the mutiny with startling clarity, painting a picture of just how raw and precarious the crew's relationships had become. Ultimately, trust, or the lack of it, could mean the difference between life and death. If sailors couldn't count on one another during a storm, ropes would snap, sails would tear, and lives would be lost. If they couldn't stand together during battles against rival ships or hostile locals, survival wasn't guaranteed. Even during daily chores, teamwork was essential. One sailor fumbling a knot could slow down the entire process, putting everyone else at risk. In that sense, every relationship on board carried high stakes. There was no room for gossip or petty grudges when the survival of the ship relied so heavily on cooperation. But what's striking is how often the crew did rise above their differences. Despite the violence, the mutinies, and the endless hunger, the men often united when it mattered most. They laughed together, worked together, and, at least sometimes, found ways to forgive one another. It wasn't friendship in the usual sense. It was more like a reluctant, slightly bitter solidarity. And maybe that was enough. When everything else felt ready to collapse, the simple knowledge that someone had your back, even grudgingly, was a kind of comfort you couldn't afford to lose. Still, the tensions of the voyage were always there, lurking beneath the surface. Some men simply couldn't take it anymore. They'd lash out, abandon their posts, or quietly plot against those they blamed for their suffering. For those trapped in these floating tinderboxes of stress, every day felt like balancing on the edge of a blade. However, when there was nothing left to fight and no more strength for conflict, the crew turned to something else. Moments of rare, fleeting relief. Games, songs, even a little joking around when the officers weren't looking. These slivers of humanity kept them going when everything else seemed ready to fall apart. And surprisingly, those small joys became just as important for survival as water or food. What did sailors do to get through the long, grim stretches of the voyage? Let's look at how they found relief in the bleak monotony of life at sea. Imagine this. You're standing on the deck after a grueling day of hauling ropes and scrubbing planks, every muscle in your body screaming for rest. But the sun's just gone down. The cool night air feels almost refreshing after the stale, suffocating heat below deck. And for once, there are no barks of orders tearing through the silence. This rare moment of calm isn't just a break in the monotony, it's a lifeline. For sailors trapped on Magellan's ship, those fleeting moments of relief meant everything. They weren't just passing time, they were keeping their sanity intact. Despite the unrelenting hardships, sailors carved out small pockets of joy wherever they could. Gambling was a universal pastime, though joy is probably a stretch when you think about what was really at stake. Dice games were the most popular, and sailors would crouch in tight groups, rolling weathered bone dice across makeshift game boards, scratched into crates or planks. There wasn't much to bet with. No one on Magellan's ship had pockets full of treasure, but that didn't stop them from wagering their few cherished possessions. Maybe a slice of hardtack that wasn't as infested as the rest, or a tangle of rope someone had secretly stashed for when supplies ran low. It wasn't about the winnings, really. Rolling those dice, groaning at your bad luck, or laughing when someone else lost. It was a distraction. A brief moment where you could pretend you weren't staring at an endless horizon of water, with no idea when or if you'd see land again. Music was another escape, though chances were slim anyone on board was a born virtuoso. Instruments were scarce, and the ones that made the voyage, simple flutes, battered drums, maybe a fiddle or two, weren't always in the best shape. Still, that didn't stop the crew. The sound of a sailor's cracked off-key voice singing a shanty could echo across the deck, pulling more voices into the chorus until the whole crew was belting out a tune about women and wine and warm beds on shore. Shanties weren't just entertainment, they were rhythm. Songs helped the sailors keep time while hauling ropes or turning the capstan, making even the most back-breaking labour a little more tolerable. And when the workday finally ended, those same songs gave the crew a chance to let go, however briefly, of the weight of survival. For a moment, the ship wasn't just an endless grind of duty and misery. It was a stage. Storytelling was equally important, and you'd find sailors huddled together sharing exaggerated tales of their exploits, or half-remembered legends from back home. The stories were almost never true, but no one cared. A man might recount how he wrestled a shark and won, or swear he'd seen an island inhabited entirely by golden-haired women. The more outrageous, the better. These weren't meant to be believed, just enjoyed. Listening to someone else spin a tale gave you something else to think about, somewhere else to be, even if only in your imagination. And each story served as a subtle reminder. You weren't alone out here. Every man had his own history, his own dreams and demons. That shared sense of humanity created bonds stronger than any rope on board. For some, the easiest way to pass the time was with needlework. It sounds surprising, doesn't it? But sailors spent hours mending sails, patching up their worn clothes, or taking tiny scraps of fabric and turning them into personal projects. Some would stitch intricate patterns into black kerchiefs, mementos of a life spent on the sea. Others worked on more elaborate pieces, like altar cloths intended as offerings to be given at whatever chapel they stumbled into once they reached port, if they ever did. The work was practical, sure, but it was also meditative, easy to get lost in, even on the roughest seas. Those little pieces of needlework were more than just necessities or keepsakes. They were defiant declarations that even in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but misery, the human need to create could still push through. Knot-making took on a similar importance. It wasn't just a skill for handling rigging or securing cargo, though mastering knots absolutely mattered when it came to survival on those open seas. During quieter moments, sailors would take those same skills and craft intricate knot designs. They turned pieces of rope into decorative knife handles, or wove compact, meticulously knotted covers for their telescopes and sewing boxes. It was creativity carved out of utility, and there was an undeniable pride in crafting something beautiful with tools meant for survival. When you held something you'd made, it gave you a fleeting sense of control, a reminder that you weren't just surviving. You were making a mark, however small, in a world that felt like it might forget you otherwise. Then there were tattoos. These weren't the polished, detailed designs you imagine today. No fancy machines or sterile conditions. Just needles, ink made from soot or gunpowder, and a lot of patience. Tattoos marked the sailor's body with their experiences, an anchor for someone who'd crossed a major ocean, a cross to symbolize faith, or maybe desperation. Some designs reflected love, like initials of someone left behind on shore. Others captured memories, symbols of the trials faced during the voyage. Whatever the image, it wasn't just decoration, it was identity. Out here on the ship, far removed from everything familiar, tattoos became a way to claim something personal in an otherwise impersonal, brutal environment. Each mark on the skin said not just who you were, but what you'd been through. And then there were moments of near silence, where the crew relaxed not with activities, but with simple human companionship. A group of sailors might sit together on the deck, quietly puffing on wooden pipes, sharing stories or just staring out at the ocean in a kind of unified daze. Words didn't always feel necessary. Sometimes, just having someone next to you, a reminder you weren't truly alone, was enough. Still, this makes it sound simple, maybe even cozy, but don't romanticize it too much. These moments of relief were rare and fragile. For every stolen laugh or shared story, there was the looming reality of disease, hunger, and the tightly wound tension of too many men locked in too small a space for too long. Disputes could erupt at any moment, even during leisure time. A dice game might end with fists flying, or teasing could take a sharp turn into outright hostility. But these moments of conflict didn't erase the need for escape. If anything, they made it more urgent. The simple truth. These distractions weren't just about passing the time, they were about holding back despair. Knowing you had another day of cold, grey water ahead, another day of no fresh food, no news from home, no guarantee you'd survive, was a weight no one could carry alone. Whether it was a shanty, a gambling game, or a piece of knot art with no practical purpose at all, these small joys stitched the crew together in ways no official order could. They weren't just sailors working to keep a ship afloat. For a few moments each day they were people. Of course, no amount of singing or stories could fully protect them from the harsher realities of their voyage. Beneath the camaraderie and the brief respites, life on board remained a daily fight for survival, and despite their best efforts to maintain morale, some moments were too catastrophic to escape. Two events, in particular, became defining chapters of Magellan's expedition, moments where the fragile bonds of survival were tested in ways the crew never anticipated. Let's step into those stories next. Sometimes, survival comes down to the moments you least expect. On Magellan's voyage, these moments were defined not just by the ocean or hunger, but by human choices. Choices born of distrust, desperation, and defiance. One such moment unfolded in Patagonia, a cold, barren place where the crew stopped to survive the winter. But the real storm wasn't outside. It was brewing between the men aboard. The mutiny at St. Julian, as it came to be known, was more than just an argument among sailors. It was a calculated rebellion, planned by the Spanish captains who had grown tired of Magellan's leadership. Men like Juan de Cartagena, Gaspar de Quesada, and Luis Mendoza weren't just officers. They were respectable figures with enough influence to lead a rebellion. Their frustrations simmered as the voyage dragged on. They accused Magellan of recklessness, claiming his decisions were driving the fleet to ruin. To them, he was a Portuguese captain who didn't belong leading a Spanish expedition. And they didn't just whisper these doubts among themselves. They acted. Late one night, the mutineers seized control of 3 of the fleet's 5 ships. In the dim light of flickering lanterns, they wrested control from loyal officers, locking them away and declaring their intent to depose Magellan. Think about the stakes here. Most of the fleet had turned against him. The sheer audacity of what was unfolding should have been enough to force Magellan into surrender. But that wasn't Magellan. Retreat wasn't in his vocabulary. With just 2 ships under his command, he launched a counter-offensive. It wasn't a battle of brawn. It was all about strategy. Magellan sent loyalists under the guise of negotiations. Once aboard the mutinous ships, they sprang into action, overpowering the traitorous officers with sheer force and locking them below deck. By the time dawn lit the cliffs of Patagonia, Magellan had not only crushed the rebellion, but also reasserted his dominance over the entire fleet. The consequences came swiftly. Gaspar de Quesada, one of the mutiny's ringleaders, was executed, his body left swinging as a stark reminder of what happened to those who dared to betray the captain. Luis Mendoza, another key conspirator, met a similar fate. But the punishment reserved for Juan de Cartagena was perhaps the most chilling. He wasn't killed outright. No, that wouldn't send the right message. Instead, Magellan deemed Cartagena and a priest complicit in the mutiny and marooned them on a barren island in the middle of nowhere. No food, no water, just the grim fate of starvation or exposure. The remaining sailors had no choice but to take the scene as a warning. How do you process something like that? The body of a hanged man swaying with the breeze, or the knowledge that 2 of your officers were left behind to die, slowly and alone? It wasn't just morale that took a hit. It was trust. Sure, the mutiny itself was over, but the fear of betrayal lingered like smoke in the air. Magellan had proven his authority, but the cost was silence and suspicion among the ranks. That might sound like the climax of Magellan's challenges, but it wasn't. Another moment, perhaps even darker, lay ahead. And this one didn't come from within. This time it came from the shores of Mactan, a small island in the Philippines, where ambition pushed Magellan past the limits of reason. It happened on April 27th, 1521, just over a year after that mutiny in Patagonia. By then, Magellan's fleet was battered. They'd circumnavigated some of the harshest waters on Earth, endured starvation, disease, and infighting, and yet somehow managed to survive and thrive among foreign kingdoms in the Pacific. Magellan, however, wasn't content with merely surviving. He wanted influence. He had aligned himself with a local chieftain named Raja Humabon, attempting to convert him and his people to Christianity. This was more than just religion. It was a political move, an attempt to cement relations and secure his expedition's success. But not every chieftain was willing to bow to foreign powers. Enter Lapu-Lapu, a rival chieftain on the neighbouring island of Mactan. Unlike Humabon, Lapu-Lapu wasn't impressed by European weapons or promises of divine salvation. When Humabon's entreaties failed to sway him, Magellan took matters into his own hands. Maybe it was hubris. Maybe it was a misguided sense of invincibility. Whatever the reason, he decided to make an example out of Lapu-Lapu. If he could dominate this island, it would solidify his alliance with Humabon and send a message that Magellan wasn't to be defied. So he gathered a small force of around 60 men and set sail for Mactan. The battle that followed wasn't the grand display Magellan had envisioned. It was a disaster. Magellan severely underestimated the local warriors. Armed with little more than bamboo spears and wooden shields, Lapu-Lapu's fighters vastly outnumbered the Europeans. The ship's cannons, which had provided such an advantage in previous encounters, were useless here. The reef surrounding Mactan made it impossible to anchor the ships close enough to fire. Forced to wade ashore, Magellan and his men were exposed, slowing as they trudged through shallow water and sinking sand, surrounded by the enemy before they even reached the beach. What followed was chaos. The descriptions are brutal. Lapu-Lapu's warriors swarmed the Europeans with unrelenting force. Their spears and daggers pierced through the sailors' armour, exploiting every gap in the metal plates with terrifying precision. Archers rained arrows down over the invasion party as Magellan tried to form a defensive retreat. But it wasn't enough. One by one, his men fell. Magellan himself fought with a kind of fiery, desperate courage that might have been admired if it hadn't been utterly futile. He ordered his men to flee back to the boats while he held the line, sword and shield in hand, standing chest-deep in the waves. He took multiple blows before finally succumbing, his body swallowed by the same sands where he thought he'd secure victory. The news of Magellan's death rocked the fleet. Morale plummeted. He wasn't just their captain, he was the symbol of everything they were enduring this for. His death meant more than just the loss of a leader. It meant the loss of direction, of strategy. The man who had steered them through treacherous waters and internal rebellions was now gone. For the remaining crew, survival meant scraping together what little strength and unity they had left. But the ripples of that moment went even further. Magellan's death altered how the local leaders viewed the Europeans. Raja Humabon, seeing how easily Lapu-Lapu's warriors defeated the supposedly invincible newcomers, turned on them too. The few Europeans who stayed behind in the Philippines were killed in retaliation. Magellan's ambition had ignited a spark, and it burned through whatever alliances the fleet had managed to build. What makes these events so striking isn't just their chaos, it's the sheer cost they revealed. One moment of rebellion and one moment of overconfidence were enough to nearly dismantle the entire mission. At St. Julian, the mutiny revealed how fragile leadership was. Even loyalty could be bought or lost with hunger, fear, or desperation. At Mactan, the battle revealed how small the Europeans truly were in the face of forces they didn't try to understand. Discipline and technology weren't always enough to win. Sometimes even the strongest leaders made mistakes that couldn't be undone. Despite these devastating losses, the expedition pushed forward. The remaining men, just a fraction of the original crew, eventually completed the mission Magellan had set out to achieve. But by the time they arrived back in Spain, circumnavigation of the globe complete, less than 20 men remained. They had achieved something historic, yes, but it came at an unimaginable price. So, now you're left with this. Was it worth it? Depending on how you see it, Magellan's expedition was either a testament to human resilience or a harsh lesson in the costs of ambition. Either way, the crew's hardships give us something to think about before bed, namely, just how soft our own lives really are. And maybe, just maybe, a little gratitude for the warm, clean blankets you're wrapped in right now. What they achieved was beyond belief, a complete circumnavigation of the Earth. Out of 270 men, 18 returned, gaunt and broken, aboard the Victoria. Yet, their journey proved that the world could be conquered in a way no one imagined. Human resilience and determination triumphed, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Now, as you sink into your soft bed, think about how far humanity has come. Fresh water, plentiful food, and a safe harbour. Things they could only dream of. Rest easy tonight, wrapped in the quiet comforts they never knew, and may sleep carry you far, somewhere warm and peaceful.